Dr. Hall is a professor in Regent University's Robertson School of Government and director of the Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy's Religious Liberty in the States. He earned a BA in Political Science from Wheaton College and a PhD in Government from the University of Virginia. He has written, edited, or co-written 15 books, including Did America Have a Christian Founding? Separating Modern Myth from Historical Truth.
I want to begin a bit more broad, and then we'll see how far we get through the talk. I understand you got a copy of the book, Did America Have a Christian Founding? And so I'll sort of lead into the subject by talking about the lead question, Did America have a Christian founding? What I found as a beginning as a graduate student, I started reading really widely on these topics, and basically there's two big answers to this question. One is, yes, of course, America had a wonderful, godly Christian founding. The founders were all evangelical Christians, and George Washington, if he were alive today, would certainly be worshiping in an evangelical megachurch. The authors of these books tend to not be academics. They tend to be popular Christian writers, and they aren't always that careful with their use of evidence. They sometimes use quotations that were fabricated and make leaps of logic. So it's really easy to dismiss these books. Now, these books have been criticized by other academics, including other academics at Christian colleges, pointing out their weaknesses. So I'm not so concerned with this set of books. I'm very concerned, on the other hand, with probably the majority of literature written by scholars and popular authors alike, by people at the best institutions in our land, places like Cornell, University of Chicago School of Law, and so forth. And their answer to the question is no, absolutely not. America did not have a Christian founding. In fact, most of America's founders were deists. They created a godless constitution, and they wanted to strictly separate church and state, to build a wall of separation between church and state. And I think these answers or those positions are just flat out wrong. What I do, if you haven't read the book yet, what you'll see is each chapter of the book, I begin with probably about 6 quotations with, again, very prominent scholars. These aren't from tweets, they aren't from the internet. They're academic books and bestseller books published by Norton and this sort of thing. Where they will argue, where they will say things like most of America's founders were deists. So you have about 6 quotations. If you go to the end note, you'll see another 12 quotations. So I'm trying to make it clear I'm not attacking a straw person here. And that book's largely a project of demolition. And then we'll do that. Then perhaps we can talk about positive ways in which Christianity influenced the America's founders. So let me begin with a few definitional issues. So how would we know if America had a Christian founding? What would a Christian founding look like? And in considering a couple possible answers to this, I'll have a chance to throw out some data that might be useful in your courses. So one possibility is that simply if we could go back in time and talk to America's founders, they would identify themselves as Christians. If this is what we mean by a Christian founding, then indisputably America had a Christian founding. About 98% of Americans of European descent are Protestants, 2% Roman Catholic, and you have about 2,000 Jews in 4 or 5 American cities. So an overwhelmingly Christian population. Now you'll note, of course, I'm not talking about enslaved Americans or Native Americans, so I'm leaving them to the side. That's not a matter of disrespect. But when we're thinking about the founding of America, America's break from Great Britain, the creation of our constitutional order, enslaved Africans, Native Americans really didn't play much of a role in that. Whereas the sort of people in Philadelphia in 1787 and the state ratification conventions and the state legislatures, they would be this population I'm talking about. So overwhelmingly Christian, but that's not a really interesting answer. These could have been Christians self-consciously attempting to create a secular political order. This could have been Christians influenced by non-Christian sources. And so, self-identification isn't all that interesting to me. A slightly more interesting possibility is one might want to argue that they were all Orthodox Christians, Christians that accept the basic doctrines of Christianity as articulated in the Apostles' Creed or Nicene Creed, something like that. The problem with that possibility is it's really hard to know what a number of the founders believed. Now, with the big boys, the Thomas Jeffersons, the John Adams, we have reams of paper, book after book after book of their letters and documents. And so you can kind of get at that. So we can know for sure that, for instance, a Jefferson, a Franklin, and an Adams are not Orthodox Christians. They're crystal clear in their denial of basic tenets of Christianity. But when we get beyond these really important founders, the founders that saved their papers, when we get down to a Patrick Henry, a George Mason, a Roger Sherman, oftentimes the documentation is very sparse. So it's hard to say, we can say for sure that such and such was a member of this church, maybe on the vestry, but it's hard to go much beyond that. I do think, and I think I do this pretty well, the claim that most of America's founders were deists is easily falsifiable, and I believe I demolished that in the book. There's a couple of other possibilities, but I want to jump to where I land, and that'll allow us to progress. I think the idea of a Christian founding is best understood as America's founders were influenced by Christian ideas or ideas developed within the Christian tradition of political reflection. And here I'm in very good company. Book after book has been written about whether or not the founders were influenced by Lockean liberalism, the classical Republican tradition, the Scottish School of Moral Sense. So I'm sort of putting Christianity on the table here. And of course, no one would say it was all one thing or the other, and I'm not saying that to be sure. But I would say Christianity was maybe a preeminent influence, and it's one that needs to be taken very seriously if we want to have an accurate account of America's founding. All right, well, if we turn, and I'm just going to jump, one of the things I do if I had the freedom to give this entire talk is I'd consider a couple of different possibilities for when America was founded. At least one possibility would be the early colonial settlements. I think that's the easiest case, right? Especially in New England, but even as we go south to the mid-Atlantic colonies, to the southern colonies, it's pretty evident through the sort of laws on the books, the charters, and this sort of thing. Jumping to the thing we're celebrating this year, the 250th anniversary of America, the Declaration of Independence. Well, that's a good possibility. You could say America was founded in 1776. I really like that possibility. And the Declaration of Independence then is our kind of a mission statement for the United States of America, especially that wonderful second paragraph. So that's a possibility, but it's kind of interesting. Some people don't like that as a possibility. You could raise some objections. First of all, you could say, what exactly happened after the Declaration of Independence? What was created? Was the United States of America created, or were 13 independent sovereigns essentially created? Sovereigns that eventually came to work together under the Articles of Confederation, and then, of course, eventually the founders met in Philadelphia to create and design the constitutional order under which we live today. And so one might point to the Constitution as the real origins of the United States of America. I'm going to just jump right to the Constitution to give you a couple of ideas about how I approach this anyway, and then we'll maybe leave off with religious liberty. Before I get to the actual Constitution, though, let me call your attention to a really interesting study that really could be redone today so much better. A guy named Donald Lutz, about 40 years ago, did a wonderful survey of the political literature of the American founding. He looked at, literally, he began with multiple thousands of documents. He whittled them down to about 920, and then he went through these documents and he simply counted citations. Who are the founders citing in their political documents? So he's not doing devotional literature or agricultural literature, it's actual political documents. And what he found is the Bible was by far and away the most cited work, cited something like 32% of the time. All Enlightenment works combined were cited about 22% of the time. So you got Montesquieu, Locke, Beccaria, Smith, and so forth and so on, 22% of the time versus 32% of the time. This study, incidentally, was published in my discipline's premier journal, the American Political Science Review. Now, poor Donald Lutz was doing this by hand, right? You can imagine today with everything that's been digitized and the ability to search digital manuscripts, I think this could be done so much better. The study is very limited, though, and I think, in fact, he drastically undercounts references to the Bible because he tells us he is not including political sermons if they don't also have citations to secular authors. Now, political sermons in this era were a very important form of political literature. Oftentimes, what would happen is you'd have a legislature that's meeting together for the first time in the year. They would invite a minister to come and preach the sermon, reminding the elected legislators of their duties. Then oftentimes the legislature would vote to thank the priest or the minister and then to publish the sermon. And so that it would be widely distributed, right? But Lutz tells us he's not going to count those if they don't also quote a Montesquieu or Beccari or someone like that. And I haven't gone through it, but my guess is that includes a lot of the sermons. More significantly, he is literally looking for citations. Micah 4:4, something like that, whereas the founders routinely alluded to Scripture or quoted Scripture without including the citation. I picked Micah 4:4 on purpose. That was George Washington's favorite verse by far and away. He alludes to it more than 40 times in a wide range of documents, public documents, private documents, and so forth and so on. Never once does he put the little parenthetical citation, Micah 4:4, after he quotes it. And so Donald Lutz would have missed all these altogether. All right, so let me jump to the Constitution and give a couple of ideas of the sort of thing I'm talking about. I think probably one of the most evident ways in which the founders were influenced by a Christian idea was their conviction that humans are sinful or self-interested. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and even redeemed humans continue to struggle with the old man within. This was a widespread commitment of America's founders. Now, you might object, that's not a distinctively Christian idea. One could imagine a Chinese peasant in the 8th century just sort of looking around and saying, wow, people are jerks. You know, people are not good, they're self-interested. So it certainly isn't a uniquely Christian idea, but in a land that is 98% Protestant, where people learn to read with the New England Primer that has a real cute little alphabet, a little rhyme scheme for learning the alphabet that begins with this: A, Adam. In Adam's sin, we fall all. This is the sort of way people are learning to read, and again, an overwhelmingly Protestant population, although Catholics believe in original sin as well. And so this idea is just widespread. So you get something like Madison in Federalist 51, if men were angels, government wouldn't be necessary, but men aren't angels. And so therefore we need government, and we need to be really careful of concentrated power. So we want separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, and this sort of thing. Enlightenment thought at the time, at least some strains of it, are going the opposite direction, saying, no, humans aren't sinful. They're perfectible. And if we just fix things like the educational system, we could arrive at utopia. So this would just be one example. Another example that really helps us with a lot of puzzles is the founders' understanding of liberty. The founders made a distinction that almost none of my students, and I teach at a Christian college, but almost none of my students make today. When it comes to liberty. What is liberty? Almost all my students will say, well, the freedom to do whatever you want except for punching someone in the nose, right? This was not at all, this is a John Stuart Mill understanding of liberty. It's a conception of liberty I kind of like, but for the founders, liberty is the freedom to do what is right. They distinguish between liberty and licentiousness. James Wilson, an early Supreme Court justice, gave a series of law lectures, and in his epigraph, he has this: law without liberty is tyranny. Liberty without law is licentiousness. And if we understand this, we can, things like the Alien and Sedition Acts all of a sudden make a lot more sense. Whereas today, they just befuddle people who, how can the same Congress that, more or less the same Congress that passed the First Amendment come back and pass the Alien and Sedition Acts? Well, it makes sense if you understand the founders' views of liberty. Let me just mention two more. One, and this is absolutely critical, the founders were convinced that that humans are created in the imago Dei, the image of God. And this means, at least in part, that we can order our lives together through reason and conviction, not by force and violence. It also, they're coming to understand some of the implications of this. Well, isn't it kind of problematic that one imager of God is owning another imager of God? Is that a possibility? And I think this conviction is one of the things that led to this movement away from slavery that we saw in this era. Let me give you a quotation from a U.S. Supreme Court opinion, Chisholm versus Georgia. Good old James Wilson again. He literally writes this in the Supreme Court opinion: man, fearfully and wonderfully made, is a workmanship of his all-perfect creator. That's in a U.S. Supreme Court opinion. Those of you who know your Bible well know this is a paraphrase of Psalm 139, verse 4, I believe. James Wilson does not include the little parenthetical citation. So Donald Lutz, if you had considered this, would have missed this reference to the Bible. Wilson then spins this out in important ways. For instance, in the law lecture, he writes that life with evident approval, he writes that life with consistency, beautiful in a deviating human life from its commencement to its close is protected by the common law from its commencement to its close. It should be protected. He later even addresses the question of suicide. Is suicide permissible? Now today, oftentimes when you ask that, the obvious response is, well, whose life is it anyway? With the implication that it's my life, I'll take it if I want. Wilson had a very different answer. He said, no, suicide is never permissible because it's not your life, in fact. It's God's life. So I think this commitment to the dignity of all persons is just critical for the American founders. Let me turn then to something more practical. Let's see, how many minutes? I have about 5 minutes, is that right? 5 minutes, okay. So religious liberty, church-state relations. Here, believe it or not, 1947, Everson versus the Board of Education, Justice Wiley Rutledge in his dissent, Justice Hugo Black in his majority opinion, they differ on how that case should be decided, but they both insist that we must interpret the religion clause. It's interesting they called it a clause, not clauses. We must interpret the religion clause in light of their generating history. And so they began this pursuit that really started in 1947. People talk about the court recently turning to history and tradition, but with respect to the religion clause of the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Since 1947, they've been originalists. All Supreme Court justices have. I wrote a law review article about this one, so I went through literally every religion clause opinion from start to finish, and I just simply, kind of like Donald Lutz, I kind of counted, okay, who are these guys citing, who's making historical arguments, who's not. Jurisprudential liberals are actually slightly more likely to make historical arguments than our jurisprudential conservatives, which is a little bit counterintuitive. The problem is, from my perspective, is the progressives make very bad arguments, especially with respect to the Establishment Clause. People are pretty good with respect to the religious liberty. They recognize that justices, that by the time we get to the founding era, the founders had come to a consensus that religious liberty is very important, that it certainly protects belief, but it protects freedom of worship, but it also protects your ability to act upon your religious conviction whenever possible. And there's a whole host of ways in which I could delineate this and show that really there's widespread conviction on this point. So I want to go to the Establishment Clause. Congress shall make no law respecting establishment of religion, which is a bit more divided, let's put it that way. And it's divided in part because of what Black and Rutledge did in Everson versus the Board of Education. They adopted a syllogism that is just really bad history. And it goes something like this. We must interpret the Establishment Clause in light of the founders' views. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison equal the American founders. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison wanted a wall of separation between church and state. Therefore, the Establishment Clause requires a wall of separation between church and state, or strict separation of church and state. This is just horrible history, and I'll begin to make that case. I won't be able to finish it, but I'll begin to make it by talking about Thomas Jefferson. Because that's counterintuitive, right? You would think, obviously, Thomas Jefferson wanted this sort of wall of separation between church and state. He, after all, uses this metaphor in a letter to the Danbury Baptists in 1802. But if you actually pay attention to Jefferson, as governor of Virginia, he issues a call for prayer. When he designs America's seal in 1776, the image he would have used is the people of Israel fleeing Egypt, with Pharaoh and his army chasing them, and Moses up on a hill holding his hands up in the Red Sea engulfing the army of Pharaoh. So this is Thomas Jefferson for our national seal. This is what he would have had. He didn't get his way. Of course, we ended up going in a different direction thanks to Charles Thompson. But I will close with this because I just love the connection between actually I can make two connections here, but I'll just make this one. Literally, one day after Thomas Jefferson finished his letter to the Danbury Baptist, he went to church in the U.S. Capitol building. where he heard John Leland, that great Baptist itinerant minister, and himself an opponent of religious establishments, preach. Jefferson also made the War Department building and the Treasury Department building available for worship services on a Sunday. And I could give you more evidence for Jefferson, I could give you more evidence for Madison, but then if I turn from Jefferson and Madison to the rest of America's founders, what you see is just absolutely no evidence that the founders wanted a wall of separation between church and state. Basically, the Establishment Clause does what the clear word suggests. It says we are not going to have a national church. The founders understood about national churches, right? England had a national church, 9 of the 13 colonies and then states had official establishments. We aren't going to have an official establishment. Otherwise, all sorts of things are permitted, and what we can do is have an honest debate about whether or not things like school vouchers that can be used at private religious schools are a good idea or not, but certainly there's no Establishment Clause barrier to that sort of thing. All right, so I will stop there. Thank you.
Join us in falling in love with America again.